What I'd like to do before I start some introductions is just talk a little, take 2 minutes and talk about Western Progress. We've been organized for about the last 9 months, so we're relatively new. We're focused on policies, progressive common sense policies, and promoting them for across the Rocky Mountain region. And that's from Montana down to Arizona and New Mexico. So it's 8 states, all very diverse, all doing a lot of things, and with a lot of good people that are elected. And some of those you'll hear definitely from one of them tonight, and also I'm going to introduce a couple of those elected officials tonight also. But the West is obviously the most changing part of the country, an area of the greatest diversity, an area of the greatest population change. And what Western Progress is about is promoting some progressive, common sense policy solutions to meet some of the challenges that we face. We're focused the next 2 days on the restoration economy, and that's one of the biggest challenges that the West has because we have so much land that has been damaged over the years and land that needs to be restored, and we're going to talk about the economic opportunity that comes through that restoration process. In preparation for this, sent you out a thumb drive with some material. I hope you got a chance to read it and hope you like the format of the thumb drive. We spent a lot of time developing that. And it has some case studies from across the West because we don't believe in reinventing the wheel. We believe in highlighting what's working. And then we had a great forest policy restoration paper done by Wally Covington and Diane Vorsick, who are here and going to be presenting tomorrow in terms of some of the opportunity that lies with forest restoration, some activities that have occurred across the West. And then we had Policy States Network, who we'll hear from on Friday, really kind of summarize all the actions from across our region and some of the things that are working, and hopefully through that we'll come up with some recommendations for policy actions that individual states can take. Again, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but building on what's working in other places. What I'd like to do is start with some introductions, and first our board of directors. We have 2 members from our board here. We have Bill Rowe from Tucson, and Anna Whiting-Sorrell from here in Montana. We also have a couple elected officials who I want to thank for making the trip and taking some time out of their busy schedules. We have the Colorado House Majority Leader, Alice Madden. And we also have Arizona State Senator Tom O'Halloran. These are 2 of those elected officials that I talked about from across our region who are really promoting progressive solutions in our state legislatures and hopefully putting together models that we can promote across the region and across the country. We also have obviously spent a lot of time from our staff in terms of work in putting on the workshop, and you're going to see the fruits of that over the next 2 days. And what I'd like to do is have our staff stand up and be recognized. One of the reasons we came to Missoula to hold this workshop was not just because one of our 3 offices is located in Missoula, but that's certainly a good reason. This is a beautiful community. But we chose this community because of the great work that Montana has done, the leadership role Montana has assumed in the restoration economy and recognizing the value, the economic value and other values which come through restoring our lands that have been damaged by either activities in mining, in terms of forest issues, in terms of grassland issues. And you're going to be hearing again about some of those issues over the next couple of days. But one of the reasons we wanted to come to Montana again is because of the leadership role that has taken place. And of course, our keynote speaker has led those efforts, as he does most efforts in Montana. Governor Brian Schweitzer was born in Montana. He comes from a ranching family. He has run a successful farming and ranching business in Montana. He has really looked at and been very involved in farming and business activities across 5 different continents, I understand, in his early years, particularly in the irrigation business. He was elected governor, Montana's 23rd governor in 2004. He also has the first dog of Montana here, Jag, who's under the table there, but you'll get to meet Jag later, I'm sure. Montana, over the last 3 years that the governor has been governor, has really enjoyed an economic renaissance. It's in the midst of an economic boom. It's got record low unemployment, so record employment. It's got budget surpluses that are record, and it's also got rising incomes, which is a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the opportunities with a restoration economy. Just today, Montana was recognized again for being one of the leaders in the country in terms of rising incomes for its residents. So, in short, Montana is a success. The governor also, besides having a passion for restoration, also has a passion for education and has been a leader in prioritizing all-day kindergarten in Montana and also investing in education through some of those surpluses that I talked about. The governor is a very popular governor. He is a governor who is energetic and all across the state. Pat Williams, our director for our Northern Rockies office and former congressman for 18 years in Montana, told me that not too long ago the governor went to a graduation ceremony in a remote part of Montana where there was only one graduate because he thought it was important to go there, not for the publicity. And that's the kind of governor he is. He's also very non-traditionalist. For instance, he chose as his running mate a Republican, a moderate Republican. And so you had a Democrat and a Republican on the ticket. And obviously the governor got elected, and so did the lieutenant governor, John Bollinger. The governor is a person who's involved in a lot of things and has got a lot of good ink across the country. I had an opportunity one time when I worked for Governor Napolitano a couple years ago where I received, I was in early in the morning and so I was answering the phone. I picked up the phone and I heard, "Hi, this is Brian Schweitzer. Is Janet there?" And I said, "Well, no, this is 7:30 in Phoenix. She's not here yet, Governor. And what can I do for you?" He goes, "Well, I'm going to go to Iraq and I'm going to visit my troops and I'm going to see what's going on there. And I want to invite her to go along with me." And I said, "Well, I'm sure she'd be happy to do it. I don't know what her schedule is, but I'll certainly relay the message." And he said, "Well, please do. I think it's a good opportunity and something that we ought to do." And he'll finish the story when it gets up here in terms of what took place after that. Let's give a great round of applause to a great governor, a champion of progressive and common sense policies in the West, Governor Brian Schweitzer.
Well, thank you. Welcome to Missoula. Welcome to Montana. A few months ago, got a call from a lady, and she identified herself, and she explained that she's an author, and she explained that she had written many books and that her books had sold a great number of books around the country, around the world. And then she said something to me. She said, and Governor, I'm interested in coming to visit with you in the Capitol because I'm interested in writing a book about what's happening there in the Capitol. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, isn't that something? You got a big shot writer going to write a book about me. They paid attention and they see that we have the best economy in the history of Montana, created the greatest number of new jobs at highest wages in the shortest period of time in the history of Montana. We have the lowest unemployment in America, the lowest unemployment in the history of the state. We've cut more taxes for more Montanans than any governor in the history of Montana. We've invested more new money in K-12. In fact, we nearly doubled the investment in K-12 education in a 2.5-year period. And for the first time in a generation, tuition will not increase at our universities. And we have a scholarship program called the Best and Brightest, so that every middle-class family, even those that came from families where their parents didn't even graduate from high school, like mine, can afford to go to college. And I'm thinking about all of those things as she's describing and writing this book. And she said, well, when I do come to the Capitol, I hope that you can bring Jag, because I want to write a book about your dog. So she came by and she interviewed Jag and got a little bit more information about his family and his habits. And in fact, she's now written this book. And the first edition is out. The hard copy sold out in 5 days. Now, this is the story about Jag, who was the last pup in the litter on a ranch in Whitefish, who grew up to be the first dog of Montana. And furthermore, this is a story about how this dog, the rest of the pups in the litter were left back at the ranch, and his mother and grandmother were still back at the ranch, and the newly elected governor selected the last pup in the litter to come down to Helena. And he got down to Helena, and he tried to make friends with the city dogs, the big dogs, the furry dogs, the little dogs, the bird dogs. You can see the picture, and they all just looked down their nose at this cow dog, and he just wanted to chase the chickens and the cows, and no, they don't do that. So he goes over to the Capitol, and people are coming and going and going and coming, and they've got all this paperwork. He has no idea what's going on. And finally, Phoebe the pigeon and Sid the squirrel come to the window, and they whisper under the window, and they explain to him how state government works, who these people are, what a legislator is, what a House member, what a senator is, what the governor does, what the Supreme Court does, how a law is passed. And so teachers all over Montana, and apparently moms and dads are buying this book. And you know what I like most about this book is the vision across Montana, in all of the Republican homes across Montana, as they're tucking their 9-year-old into bed, and the 9-year-old has said, please, please, read the story about Jag again. You can imagine what's going through their minds. You know, about 10,000 years ago, plus or minus a few, there was a big cold time, and there was a big ice bridge from Asia over to what we now call Alaska. And a lot of Asian people took advantage of that, and they walked across that bridge, and they came over to what we now consider North America, and they worked their way down through Montana, and some went on south, and the lucky ones stayed behind right here in Montana. And for the next 10,000 years, minus 200 years, they made a living here. And they named all the mountains and the rivers. They named that gentle breeze that comes over the mountains and melts the snow in the spring of the year. They named all of the animals, and they coexisted on this place that we call Montana. And for 10,000 years, they were able to hand Montana on to the next generation in better shape than they found it. That was for roughly 10,000 years. And then apparently this little fellow from France owned, or considered that he owned, a good part of the western United States, and he was having some trouble in Russia. So he sold what he considered to own here in the western United States, and Thomas Jefferson sent a couple of guys out here. You know the story, Lewis and Clark, and they led an expedition of men, and they worked their way up the Missouri River, and they made it as far as what we consider western North Dakota during the very first year, and then they finally got froze out, and here they were in an Indian village, and it had been cold and then colder and then coldest, and they were in a teepee, and it was about 35 degrees below zero, and they didn't like to talk about this. Men never like to talk about this, but after a couple of weeks, Lewis turned to Clark and he said to him, "You have any idea where we're at?" "No idea." Said, "No idea." "Any idea how far it is to the Pacific?" "Nope." "No idea." "Any idea how long it would take us to get back home?" "Nope, none whatsoever." "You think we ought to ask for directions?" And they talked about it a little bit, and they were cold enough, how men are, when they get pushed right against the wall. So they found an Indian woman, and they asked her if she could find her way to the Pacific. And she led them across Montana, led them over the Rocky Mountains, and she took them all the way to the Pacific. Now, we didn't think much of it because they reported back to Thomas Jefferson that it was a big desert out here, and there were some strange animals, and the wind blew too hard, and it was too cold in the winter, and other than that, there wasn't much we could do here. And then about 50 years later, we discovered gold in Montana. And they rushed into Montana, and they came from all over the world. They came from Europe. Many of the Confederates came here, frankly, after the Civil War. And they came from Asia, and everyone with a pick, digging a hole in the side of the mountain because they were all going to strike it rich. Very few did. Some made a fair bit of money selling the picks. Some people made a fair bit of money transferring the picks to Montana and the broke miners home. But a little gold was found, and along the way, these miners had to eat, and so the cattlemen from Texas moved those cattle north, and they built ranches to feed those miners. And then, of course, the boom and the bust of the mining industry and the silver panic of the 1890s, and the mining industry was about shot. And about that time, Montana finally came to forefront of the place for people to homestead. And so they came from the east. They came from Europe, like my grandparents. I'm half Ukrainian and I'm half Irish, and my grandparents homesteaded here. And what they came here for is the free land. It was 320 acres. It was an opportunity for you to own something. And most of the people that came to Montana came here with nothing but the clothes on their back and high hopes and faith in God. And they turned that prairie over and they planted wheat, and nearly every one of them went broke. The smart ones left, started a business someplace else. The poorest of them, the ones who didn't speak English or didn't have any capabilities, they stayed and they stuck it out, and they became the farmers of Montana. It's been the history of this place, boom and bust. But remember, for 10,000 years, the people that lived here and coexisted here, they were able to hand this place along to the next generation in better shape than they found it. And in 150 years, we've screwed up almost the whole state. We've got a hole dug in the side of a mountain all across Montana. We've dammed the rivers. We've got siltation occurring in western Montana. And this is important to all of you. It's not just some place in Montana. You know, high in the Rocky Mountains of Montana, like many of the places in the west, when the snow accumulates every winter and then it melts in the spring, it rejuvenates and renews the water supply for a good part of the country. And in Montana, like Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico, we have water that flows to the Atlantic and the Pacific. But unlike the rest of your states, high in the Rocky Mountains of Montana, we actually have water that flows to the Arctic, into the Atlantic, into the Pacific. 70% of the water that flows into the largest river system in the United States, the Missouri, comes from the snowmelt of Montana. 50% of the water that's stored in the Columbia River system comes from the snowmelt of Montana. Every spring, we renew and rejuvenate the river system and the communities across America. So that's why we think in Montana it's not a bad idea that we renew and rejuvenate the rest of the country with good ideas. And so in addition to providing a water supply for the entire country, we think high in the Rocky Mountains we can develop policy that's good for this entire country. We think it's time that we learn a little something from the people who've lived in this place the longest. You know, the folks who occupied Montana for 10,000 years, the Kootenai and the Salish and the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Blackfeet, the Sioux, Cheyenne, they had a notion about leadership. And one of the notions they had about leadership is they respected the people who had occupied this place the longest, the elders. Now, they had elected officials, just like we do, the middle-aged fire and tiger kind of guys. But the ones they respected the most, and still do, are their elders, because they have so many life experiences. And then they had another notion about leadership, and it's something that we could all learn. Before they made decisions, before they decided what they were going to do as a tribe or as a clan, they would consider the consequences, not just for the next generation or for our grandchildren. You know, politicians are always talking about our grandchildren. No, they considered the consequences for 7 generations. Can you imagine what this country would look like today if we had leaders 7 generations ago that would have considered this generation? And can you imagine what we would be doing in Montana and across the West if we considered the next generations all the way to 7 generations? What's the chances? What's the chances that those people in the 1850s and 60s would have come to Montana and dug those holes in the side of the mountain if they would have known the consequences? If they would have known that associated with the gold and silver and copper, that this pyrite that was contained in the mountain, the pyrite that had been there for billions of years, unless you're this, there's a legislator in Bozeman that criticizes me because I talk about things in geologic terms and he says the world's only 2,000 years old. So if you're just bear with me as I speak about this in geologic terms for just a moment. But if you believe that it took a few billion years to form the Rocky Mountains and the minerals in them, understand that this gold and silver that we have in the Rocky Mountains is co-associated with this pyrite. And as this snow melts and it runs across the surface and into our streams, a large part of it actually flows into the mountain itself, and then it washes its way through the mountain. It picks up some of the minerals, and then it reappears as a spring or as artesian water supplies across the prairies. But as long as we didn't expose the pyrite to oxygen, then everything was in balance. But when we dug the side of that mountain out to get to those minerals, then the water had an opportunity to run through the pyrite, exposed to oxygen, and the water that now flows out of the mountain is a pH 2 or 3. Now, in a nutshell, the problem we have with this acidic water is simply this. At a pH of 7, those heavy metals, they will remain where we found them. But as you lower the pH, the solubility of those heavy metals is increased, and so the water that flows out of the side of the mountain is now containing all of these heavy metals. And of course, all across the Rocky Mountain West, we have all of these glory holes where water is now running out of the side of the mountain and weeping into our streams and rivers and decreasing the pH of the water, bringing these heavy metals and destroying our fisheries and our water supply. This renewable source that we've had for thousands of years high in the Rocky Mountains is now and has been at risk. Well, let's move beyond the folks who were just digging the metals. Then we had the Forest Service. And the Forest Service was dedicated in the early years to cutting as many trees as fast as they could across the West and delivering those trees to the places that we're building houses. And in particular in the West, we were using those big timbers to support the mines because we were digging these deep ore shafts, and we would use these big logs to support those shafts so that we could dig the ore out. It's interesting, you know the story of Butte. You know that Butte at the turn of the century was the richest city on earth. The two richest men in the world in 1900 both lived in Butte, both were in the copper business, and they competed with one another. Two people, it'd be the equivalent of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates both being in the same business as competitors in the same town. And this is very interesting. In the early days before they built a smelter, if you can imagine this, high in the Rocky Mountains, they were digging this ore out, and the way they smelted it was they would have groups of people that would cut the logs, and they'd build these club sandwiches. They'd lay down a bunch of logs, then they'd dump some ore, then they'd dump some more logs, and then they'd have some more ore, and then on up they'd go, and they'd stack that up for about 3 or 4 stories high. And then in the winter, they'd light it. And they would just burn this whole pile. Now in Butte, the people commented how beautiful the women were because they had such white, very white skin. And of course, that was the arsenic in the air. And well, then later, of course, they built a smelter. This morning I was in Anaconda where one of the copper kings, Marcus Daly, who was an Irish immigrant, and he loved Anaconda. That was the place that he built. That was the place that he had picked. Any place in the world he could have lived because he was the richest man in the world, and he chose Anaconda. And so he had no idea when he built that smelter that he was destroying all the land around him. He had no idea that that smelter was destroying 50,000 acres that were adjacent. He had no idea that that smelter and the consequences would destroy the entire Clark Fork Basin. He had no idea that those heavy metals would flow down the Clark Fork River, and that dam that was built that you will see outside of Missoula, the mill town, captured all of those heavy metals in the middle of a river. He had no idea that he was doing that. In fact, he loved this city so much that he wanted to make it the capital of Montana. And so at that time, being the two richest people in the world, the two of them owned all of the newspapers in Montana. These two people owned all the newspapers. One owned half, the other owned half, and they decided that they wanted to choose the new capital for Montana. And the one side chose Helena, and Marcus Daly, the Irishman, the miner's miner, wanted it in the holy city of Anaconda. And so there was actually an election in Montana to choose where that state capital would be. Now, One of them owned half the newspapers, and the other owned the other newspapers. And so some of the most outrageous journalism in the history of Montana was conducted during that election. And at the end of the day, Marcus Daly lost, and Helena is now the capital. But it's interesting because, recently we've been through some elections with hanging chads, and did we count or not count all the votes, and who won and who didn't. It's interesting because Helena won by something like 640 votes. And here about 6 years ago, they were doing some renovations in the county seat in Helena, Lewis and Clark County seat, and they dug into this wall, and there were a bunch of papers in there. So they reached in and they started pulling ballots out. And there were 950 ballots marked for Anaconda. So Marcus Daly didn't get his opportunity to have his capital in Anaconda, but I was there this morning. And today we are delivering all of these heavy metals that have accumulated in the Milltown Dam, putting it on a train, we're hauling it upstream, and we're putting it in the place that we're calling the Opportunity Ponds. It's near this little town of Opportunity that is downwind from the Anaconda smokestack, because all of that land has already been destroyed anyway. So we're putting those heavy metals in, and then we're going to cap it over with topsoil. We're going to keep the pH above 7 so those heavy metals will never move again, and we're going to be able to restore that entire basin. Now, Butte, Montana, at the headwaters of all of this business, is the largest Superfund site in the United States. We now have 380 copper miners who are mining the same amount as 25,000 copper miners in 1920. And we understand who the owners are. We can follow the liability chain pretty easy here because the Anaconda Company owned this big copper mine and they destroyed the Clark Fork Basin all the way down to Milltown. And then they sold to ARCO. And when ARCO bought the assets, they also bought the liabilities. And then more recently, and this is the good news, ARCO has sold to what we now call our rich English uncle, British Petroleum. And so when they bought the assets, they also bought the liabilities, and on their books was about $500 million to clean up the Clark Fork. That's $500 million that will employ people for a generation to clean up the messes of the previous 75 years. It's $500 million that will restore the Clark Fork River so that fish now will be able to spawn all the way upstream. It's $500 million so that the water along the Clark Fork all the way to Silverbow Creek and beyond will now be drinkable, and fish will now be living in that river. Now, that's just one example in Montana. We have examples all across Montana where communities are pulling together, and sometimes it's federal dollars, sometimes it's state dollars, sometimes it's community dollars and private dollars. But we're finding out that the restoration economy will be and is every bit as big as the mining and lumber industries were during their heyday. I was at a dedication out in eastern Montana a few weeks ago, and this is along the Tongue River. This is 12 miles south of the Yellowstone River, where the Tongue River flows into the Yellowstone River. And there's a guy out there by the name of Mugley, and they've been there since 1884, and it was his grandfather that organized the ranchers in that area to build a diversion dam, raise the level of the Tongue River by 12 feet so that they could run it into a canal and they could open up 20,000 acres for irrigation. And this guy, Mugley, who's about 55 years old, remembers as he was growing up out there with a shovel, he still remembers these fish that would come out in the canal, and they would run out into his fields, and he'd be irrigating, and there would be fish coming out into his field, and he knew that he had to do something. And so he spent 30 years working in the community until he got them to agree that they were going to put a fish bypass in, so that the fish that were coming downstream on the Tongue wouldn't flow into that canal and make it out into the fields, that they would be diverted and they would be pushed right back into the main stem. But then he watched for another 20 years as those fish would come up the Yellowstone, and then they would go up. That's $50 from Montana State University. Thank you very much. And then the fish would go the 12 miles up the Tongue River until they got to that dam, and then they would just swim in circles because they couldn't make it home. We had 9 species of fish that weren't able to spawn. And this guy, Muggley, a little fella, he's in the alfalfa business, he irrigates, he runs some cows, he has an alfalfa pelleting business. Not exactly your, ponytailed hippie with a nose ring. He's a guy that watched those fish, and he prayed about it, he thought about it, and he talked about it for 20 years. And a few weeks ago, I was there with him as this new diversion had been created. So for the first time in 127 years, those fish are now going to be able to go around the dam and spawn in the upper reaches of the Tongue River. And we were there with about 150 people, most of them ranchers. Most of them don't fish. Most of them don't hunt. They have just lived along the Tongue River their whole life, and their parents before them, and they had all thought about the same thing. Wouldn't it be great if those dang fish could make it on by? Well, they put the money together. State, federal government, some conservation groups came together, put the money down, and on that day, I helped open those valves. And so the water bypass was created, and there were people standing watching the first fish in 127 years bypass that dam. And these are folks, had tears running down their eyes, who had prayed for that day, not because they fished, not because they cared necessarily about catching any fish. They just knew it was the right thing to restore it to its original state. That's a pretty special day. All across Montana, we can give you examples of what is to come. We've already invested $34 million through our legislature, and we may be the only state in the country that will have a full-time position that's in charge of restoration of Montana's economy. But you know how the legislators are. They're pesky. And I'm being charitable. And if you're going to sell an idea to them, it has to be about dollars and cents. And if you go to them and you say, oh, it's the right thing to do, oh yeah, there's a lot of other things. If you tell them the dollars and cents, if you explain to them how many jobs are created in the restoration economy, how many companies from around the world would come to Montana to ply their wares, how many families can have a sustainable living wage restoring Montana's economy instead of just tearing into the side of the mountain, then they'll start listening. And so that's why every year, every quarter, when we announce Montana's economy, and of course I mentioned to Congressman Williams here a little earlier that times are pretty good, since we've been able to cut so many taxes and we have the largest surplus in history and the greatest number of new jobs, and we were able to invest more in education and healthcare. And he said to me, rightfully so, "You're a lucky son of a bitch." And that is true. But in politics, it is better to be lucky than good, and we'll take it. We'll take it however we can get it. But the bottom line is, if I can show the legislators in Montana how many dollars and how many jobs are associated with the restoration economy, they will be lined up in the hall to vote for new initiatives for restoration in Montana's economy. And so that's why our labor department, every quarter when we announce these great numbers that we have in Montana, our lowest unemployment and new jobs at highest wages, we're not going to just talk about the agricultural jobs and the mining jobs and the oil jobs and the tech jobs and the service jobs. From now on in Montana, we'll be the first state in America. We're going to announce the number of jobs that we've created in the restoration economy. But, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, but you've got to tell this story around the country. As you know, we're in some pretty tough times in this country. There's a group of people that have taken control of this country, and the Taliban has been competing with one another who could wrap the most numbers of wraps on the towel on the top of their head, and those are the people we've been electing to Congress, and that's the guy that took over as president of this country. It's time It's time that we take this country back and we have people that recognize the importance of taking care of every one of our communities first. And that doesn't mean investing in restoration of economies all over the world. It means investing in our own restoration first. And I got to tell you, as we develop these technologies for restoration in places like Montana, remember, we only started screwing up things about 150 years ago. Things were okay when the Indians were running this thing for 10,000 years. It's only a 150-year history of messing with Mother Nature. But in Asia, in Europe, in South America, Africa, well, they've got a longer history than us. All of these restoration techniques that we develop in places like Montana are readily applicable all around the world. So as these companies and these individuals and these scientists in Montana develop new techniques for taking care of acid water flowing out of the side of a mountain, as we find new ways to take care of the penta deposits that we have across the state, as we find new ways of skimming the diesel and some of these lubricants off the top of our aquifers that Burlington Northern Santa Fe deposited without even telling us, as we find ways of solving those problems, we can export those all over the world. You know, about 6 months after I was elected, I was talking to my director of Department of Environmental Quality, and he's a good guy. And we were talking about Burlington Northern Santa Fe, you know, the barons of Fort Worth. And they own most of Montana. In fact, they consider Montana to be a wholly owned subsidiary of their railroad. And across Montana, they've pretty much had a free rein. They built these tracks, and not necessarily that they were going to be hauling wheat or coal or lumber out of Montana. They built these railroads so they could deliver big containers from China to Chicago and other commodities from Chicago and Minneapolis back to Seattle. The best thing that we could do for Burlington Northern Santa Fe is shorten the distance that they get across Montana. And they treat us that way. But in the process, they've had all of these refueling stations across Montana. And when diesel was worth 18 or 20 cents a gallon, they didn't care if they had a hole in the bottom of the tank. They didn't even keep track. And so this diesel's now run into our aquifers in a place called Livingston, Havre, where I was born, and Whitefish, where I've lived for the last 20 years, and others. And for 25 years, the state of Montana has known about it, Burlington Northern has known about it, and the two of them talked about it. For 25 years, the state of Montana said, boy, you're going to have to get this thing figured out. And they said, oh yeah, it's going to be expensive, it's going to take a little time. So they talked about it for 25 years. For 25 years, the state of Montana would send a letter to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe and give them a deadline of a certain number of days to respond to get X, Y, Z done. And they wait till the last day, and then they'd lawyer up and send a letter back and ask a few more questions. And this went on for 25 years. There was no question on who was responsible for putting the diesel there. It was a question of delaying and denying and lawyering, because that was all cheaper than cleaning it up. Does that sound familiar with some other places across the western United States? So one day I was particularly annoyed with Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and for me, every day starts with some level of annoyance with them. I called a press conference and I said, all right, we're done lawyering. Here's what we're going to do. State of Montana is going to clean it up, and we're going to send you the bill. If you don't like it, you can start cleaning it up in Whitefish, and you can clean it up in Havre, and if you get done before we finish in Livingston, more power on you. We're going to clean it up, and we're going to send you the bill. Well, for the first time in 25 years, it started making some action. And just like that, boom, 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 Burlington Northern Santa Fe's down there pumping some stuff out, and they've got people out there, and they're trying to get this stuff out as fast as they can. Well, I'm proud of them for getting one site, but for every site that we get them started on, we're finding more of what they've left behind. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I've heard people in politics talk about accountability for a long time, right? By God, we have got to hold folks accountable for their own decisions. For example, a single mom, with a couple of kids. We got to hold her accountable for her actions. So that means that we can't help her with daycare, and we can't pay for full-day kindergarten, right? You hear that? Accountable. She got herself into this mess. Well, why don't we apply that same kind of logic to Burlington Northern Santa Fe? Why wouldn't we apply that same logic to Pegasus Gold? Why wouldn't we apply that same kind of logic to other companies all over the country? But no, we're only going to apply that logic to a single mom. Well, in Montana, we've said enough is enough, and we're going to call it the way it is. You made the mess, you pay for fixing it up. And if you won't do that, we'll fix it for you. Now, a little earlier today, I stopped over at the university, and there were a group of scientists from Russia there. They were professors in science, and they were visiting the university. And so I stopped over to visit with them. And this is what I said to them a little earlier. I said to them, the history of Montana really has a great deal to do with Russia, because you see, it was during this homestead era, around the turn of the century, in Kansas and Nebraska, some in Texas, some in Oklahoma, certainly in North and South Dakota and eastern Montana, there was a huge migration of these Ukrainians. They were actually German-speaking Russians who had lived in Ukraine for maybe 150, 200 years, who knows. But some problems with the Tsar and revolution on its way, and these folks just packed up and left. And they had been making a living for 3 or 4 generations as winter wheat farmers in Ukraine. Some of them came over 15 years earlier in about 1880 and homesteaded in Oklahoma and Kansas, and they wrote back and told them what a wonderful place it was to grow wheat. And they were the people that actually brought winter wheat to the United States. They called it Turkey Red. This was that variety of wheat that you planted in the fall of the year, and then it lays dormant in the winter, and then you harvest it next year. And so a huge migration, one of the largest single migrations around the world from one place to another, and these people settled these places like Montana and the Dakotas and Kansas and Nebraska. And I explained to these Russian scientists, that's how I got here. My grandparents came during that same time. And I explained to them that my grandmother, she was German speaking, but she had never been to Germany, and neither had her grandparents, and they didn't even know anybody from Germany, but they were German speaking people. And shortly after they arrived here, there was a war, and people hated the Kaiser and hated the Germans. And so, of course, they spent most of their time trying to explain to people that while they did speak German, they weren't Germans, and they didn't like the Kaiser. They didn't even know where he lived. But in times of war in this country, people get a little crazy. And so we were attacking these German people. In Montana, for example, in 1916, 40% of the people of Montana spoke German as a first language. In 1917, Montana went first, and we passed something called the Sedition Act. And we made it, the industrialists, they had some trumped up stuff about these Central Europeans because, frankly, they worried about union organizing. They had all these Central Europeans that were coming to the lumber camps and the mining camps, and they had these ideas about union organizing, and they needed to shut this thing down. And so they decided that they would call that un-American. But you can't just simply call union organizing un-American. So they formalized it, and they called it the Sedition Act here in Montana. And they made it against a lot of union organized. They made it against the law to say anything against the war. They made it against the law to say anything negative about elected officials. They actually made it against the law to speak or pray in German in Montana. And so we started rounding people up. They hired some folks from all across Montana to be snitches, and they'd get these German-speaking people to go into the bars and the pool halls, and they'd pay them $150 for every person that they brought in that said something negative about American politician, or someone who said something positive about the Kaiser, or someone who was organizing, or anybody who was speaking in German. And so they'd bring these people in, and I got to tell you, the first guy that was actually arrested under this new Sedition Act, he actually lived about 100 miles south of Miles City, and there isn't much in Miles City now, and there was less then. And 100 miles south of Miles City is way in the middle of nowhere. Well, one night he was out on the ranch, and over a few bottles of whiskey, he said to the other ranchers that were sitting around his kitchen table, and I quote, he said that Woodrow Wilson's the lionest son of a bitch who ever served in the White House. And it was 3 days later that the sheriff of Custer County had gotten wind of it, and he came down and he arrested that guy. Well, today if we arrested people for saying the occupant of the White House is a lying son of a bitch, we'd have to put a barbed wire fence around Alaska and fill it up. Now I'm just let me follow this through. Now, he was the first one arrested, but ultimately we sent 79 people to prison. 79 people to prison in Montana for something called the Sedition Act. Now, there were many interesting stories along the way. Most of them had done nothing wrong. Most of them had just questioned authority. Some of them had been union organizers. Some of them simply were praying or reading in German, and we sent them to prison. And so, during my first legislative session, we worked with the legislature. Steve Doherty remembers this, and they passed a resolution asking Congress to repeal the Patriot Act, because we told them in Montana we thought it was un-American for neighbors to spy on neighbors. And so we packaged that whole thing up. Nearly every legislator voted for it, and I signed it. We sent it back to Washington, D.C., proud of ourselves, and, well, we never heard back. So we thought there must be some other way of talking about it in a way that even in Washington, D.C., they could understand it. So we visited with the University of Montana Law School and School of Journalism, and they began a program of looking at all 79 of those cases. And I asked them straight up, what I want you to do is to review every one of those cases and find if any one of those 79 people, had actually committed a crime that we would consider punishable by today's standards. And so they reviewed every one of those cases, and they reported back that no, none. All of them were trumped up charges and sent them off to prison for basically no reason. And so we spent several more months, and we tried to contact the families of all of these people that had been sent to prison in Montana. And on a particular day in the rotunda in the state capitol of Montana with the families who had arrived from 17 states around the country, we stood in that rotunda, and there were some very powerful words spoken about civil liberties by some of the descendants and some of the speakers, and even the governor had a few words to say. But I got to tell you, there were no more powerful words than the words of the people themselves during that time. There was a German farmer who lived outside of Billings, and he just raised barley and beets, and one day the citizen committee, so we had a citizen committee. They were appointed by the governor to go out and force these German immigrants to come to the courthouse and sing the national anthem and kiss the flag and buy war bonds. If you didn't do those things, of course, then you were not a patriot, and you were guilty of sedition. So they went out to this fellow's place, Mr. Braun, and they said to him, well, you know, we're here and we're the citizen committee, and we know that you're a good citizen. We know you love this country, but, you know, you are a German immigrant. And so we need you to come to the courthouse, sing the national anthem, and just kiss the flag, and then buy some more bonds. I shall not, he said. I'm a citizen of the United States of America. I won't do that. You can't force me to do that. What? They said, don't go through that thing. You know, we know you. We know you're a good guy. Just go through them. I will not. So they reported back to the sheriff, and the sheriff came out, and he said to him, well, just buy the war bonds, and we'll go through the motions, and you sing the national anthem, and you kiss. I will not. Well, if you don't, I have to arrest you. So he arrested him. And he brought him in, incarcerated him. There was trial, jury. They listened to the evidence, and they came back and they said, look, we know he's a good guy. If he'll just buy the war bonds, we won't I will not. So they convicted him. And then the judge leaned over and he said, Mr. Braun, if you'll just buy the war bonds, I won't send you to prison. He said, I'm an American citizen. I will not. So he sentenced him to 36 months in prison. His grandson was there that day, and Mr. Braun was a prolific writer. And so he had a stack of letters that Mr. Braun had sent to his wife, and his wife had sent back, and he read some of them to us. He read the letter that his grandmother had sent to Mr. Braun after he had been in jail for 4 months, describing to him how their 2-year-old son had died. And then, a year later, read the letter that she had written him explaining that the crop had not been what she had hoped, that she didn't have the money to hire people to work in the fields, and that she was concerned that she wouldn't have the money to make the payment to the bank. And then 5 months later, the letter that said the bank was foreclosing and there was to be a sheriff's auction. And then the letter that said that she had moved to Minnesota and that the 4 remaining children that they had were sent to other families because she couldn't afford to keep them. And there were several more letters. And then the letter that he sent to her on the 35th month. And he wrote her this letter, and he told her that he did not regret that he had said no to the things that they were telling him he must do. And he told her that I am an American citizen and I'm proud of that. And then he said to her that he would never lose faith in the good, the holy, and the true. That man was the patriot. Now, German TV was there that day, and there was some national press. I don't know why they were interested in this. It was just kind of a quirky thing that we were doing in Montana. And with the camera on me, the German reporter said to me, "Governor, we know what this is about. You're not really talking about what occurred in 1916, are you? We know that you are a champion of civil liberties. We know that you're actually talking about what's occurring in this country today, aren't you?" I said, "Well, I'm outraged that you would make such a suggestion. It's completely different today. Why, they were German-speaking people and they were Catholics. Today, they're Arabic-speaking and they're Muslim. And by the way, in 1916, there was no Mr. Google to track, and we couldn't tap their telephones. It was completely different. Nothing is the same." Well, as you know, it is exactly the same. And oh, by the way, for all of you big shots that come from all over the country, you also had a Sedition Act, because the year after we passed it in Montana, the U.S. Congress passed the same Sedition Act. And in every one of your states, you put people in prison for being patriots. Why don't you talk to your governor and see if you can pardon them back at home? Now, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what I think is happening in this country and how we managed to get to where we're at. You know, this group of people that have seized control of this country, they came to power saying that they would be people that would marshal your funds and they would protect the taxpayers' dollars. They said to you that they would be good for business. They said to you that they, being the Republicans, they would be good for business and they would grow America's economy, right? And they said to you that they would cut your taxes. And they also said to you that we will not involve ourselves in conflicts around the world. We cannot be the world's policeman. Remember that when they came to power? Well, let's talk about what they have actually done. They have run up the largest debt in history. And this is no disrespect for anybody who actually resembles these remarks, but they have spent money like drunken sailors. So for you drunks and sailors, this is no reflection on you. Now, I've thought about this a fair bit as they were spending this money, and I was thinking to myself, how in the hell are we ever going to pay this thing off? It simply meant that we needed to have a lot of children to pay this off. In fact, we don't have enough children to pay this debt off because our demographics are such that, well, you are slackers, your generation. You're not having enough children. And so the only way we can actually pay this debt off is if we have more children. So some of you thought that you had passed that age of having children, but I'm here to inform you, you've got to do America's bidding. We need more kids to pay this debt off. Actually, though, the Bush administration had a better idea. Here was their idea. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to run up the largest debt in the history of the world in dollars, and then we're going to pay them back with 62 cents. Do you know that during the last 5 years, the Canadian dollar's gone from 62 cents to $1? You know the euro's gone from 91 cents to $1.41? We've devalued our currency by 50%. And so in Montana, wheat farmers are now getting over $8 a bushel for their wheat, $3.30 for copper in Montana, cattle selling at $1.25. These ought to be the best years in the history of the state. And of course, wages are going up by 3% per year. Sounds great, doesn't it? Until you have to replace the manufacturing productive capacity, until you have to buy new steel, new tires, and you find out that they've increased by 50% because those are world commodities. And so then you find out that that $8 wheat is actually only having the buying power of $4.50, and that $3.20 copper only has a buying power of $2, and you're starting to get the picture. They have sold us down the river. Now, look, we were going to talk about Iraq. Right after I was elected, I contacted the Department of Defense and I said, I'd like to go visit my National Guard in Iraq. I think that it'd be an appropriate time for me to go over and visit them. And so I sent a letter to the President and sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense and heard nothing back. And so then I got our senior senator to work on it, and he was pushing, so I was just going to go visit her. No, nothing, still. And then I'm reading in the newspaper, the governor of this state and the governor of that state, governors from all over America are going, and I'd call them and I'd say, how the heck did you get in? I don't know, the Department of Defense called me. And here I am trying to get my way over to Iraq to see what's happening on the ground, and I was one of the last governors that was given an opportunity to go. Now, I am not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not suggesting that because I lived in Saudi Arabia for 6 years and learned to speak and understand Arabic, assalamu alaikum, I'm not suggesting that me as a governor, being maybe one of the few elected officials across this country that could tell you who a Wahhabi is and describe to you how it is that the Sunnis and Shias got in the position that they are today. I don't know if that was the reason that they didn't let me go, but I finally got to go to Iraq last May. Let me tell you what I found. Got over there and went, by the way, I went with Matt Blunt, who is the governor of Missouri, and Mitt Romney, who's the governor of, I don't know, governor of where? I don't know, Massachusetts, I guess. So we traveled together over there, and it was interesting because we get to Iraq, and of course we're shepherded around by folks, and I visited some of our Guard people at the various bases around Iraq. And then we came back to Baghdad, and we were going to fly out a little later in the afternoon. And so they wanted to show us the training of the elite forces, the special forces of the Iraqi military. Now understand this, they have 290,000 men, mostly some women, in their standing military, one of the largest militaries in the world. And this would be the hand-picked 250 people of their special forces, the equivalent of our Navy SEALs and Green Beret and Rangers all rolled into one. And training them, we had our special forces and Blackwater, which I guess you're starting to read a little bit about. And so we went to this training camp where we were training them in anti-terrorism techniques, how to go to a building with and have a shock grenade blow up, and then you rush in and you save the people that have been taking hostage, and you shoot the bad guys and you get out, and how you are able to evade when you have an IED and a caravan, and all those things. And so we're going through all of this training, and I'm having a look around, and it's 116 degrees in the shade, and about a third of them were wearing stocking caps. Now, I was wearing full body armor with a helmet, and so were they, and they were wearing their full uniforms. And in addition to that, they had stocking caps with just the holes cut out. And so there was a little break in the action, and I walked up to some of them, and I said, Assalamu alaikum. And they looked at me, and I said to them in Arabic, well, what, you'd never seen Khawaja speak Arabic before? Khawaja it's like their N-word. That's what they call us. It's kind of means blondie. That's what they call us. And then I said to them, what's with the stocking caps? And they wouldn't say. They wouldn't talk. And so I left it. And about a half an hour later, there was another break in the action, and they broke into separate groups, and they were smoking cigarettes. And so I went over and I asked them again. And this time it was a group of people all wearing stocking caps. And I asked them the question. Remember, this is the elite special forces. These are the ones that will protect each other's backside. These are the ones that, for example, you can imagine the way our Green Beret or our SEALs would be, how they would protect a person next to them or behind them or in front of them. They would give their life for their person that they're with, right? Okay, so what's with the stocking caps? They look around and they said, well, we don't want these people to know who we are because we don't want them to kill our families while we're here in training. Now, how the hell do you put a country together in a circumstance like that? You've got the elite of the elite. Look, the Sunnis and Shias and the Kurds, they're only a country because the English said they were some time ago. And the only way they were held together was with a strong-armed dictator like the rest of the countries in the Middle East. And when we came in there and eliminated that strong-armed dictator, we put ourselves in a position that either we're going to have to create this division of this country, or we've got to help them to put their own strong-armed dictator in there, or we got to let them choose their own strong-armed dictator. But either way, this problem has been brewing for a long time. We created the vacuum, and now they're fighting one another. We have no business being there in the middle of a civil war. But I got to tell you this, we are not leaving. And I wish those people that are involved in those presidential debates would be completely honest, or knowledgeable and honest. I wish the next time we had a debate or a county fair or whatever the hell they're calling those things that those presidents or presidential candidates are getting together, I wish the next time there was a question to them. And the question was any one of these questions. For example, if the question were, when are we leaving Iraq? Or if the question were, how are we going to reform our education system so that America once again becomes the most innovative engineering economy in the world? Or if the question is, how are we going to create an affordable healthcare system so every American can afford healthcare? Or if the question were, how are we going to produce our own opportunities in this country so that everyone can have a living wage here? Any one of those questions. The next president of the United States, and I don't know who that is yet, I haven't got that name, but I'm going to tell you who the next president is. The next president of the United States is the one that looks at him and says, well, I got to be honest with you, we're not leaving Iraq, if that's what the question was. Or I got to be honest with you, we can't afford to invest in an affordable health care system, we don't have any money. Or we can't afford to invest in a world-class education system with innovative engineering programs as long as we are buying 4 billion barrels of oil at $80 a barrel from dictators all over the world at $320 billion a year, leaving our economy and going to the pockets of dictators. We are not going to be able to afford health care, education. We're not going to be able to change the infrastructure in this country as long as we're sending $320 billion a year out of this country. Oh, and one more thing. We've spent $750 billion fighting a war, protecting an oil supply for the next dictator. So unless we are prepared to create a new energy dynamic in this country, create new conservation techniques so that America leads once again in decreasing our consumption of hydrocarbons, until we create new innovative engineering solutions to decrease our consumption of all energy and improve our ability to produce energy from non-hydrocarbon sources, from sources that don't put CO2 in the atmosphere. Until we find a way in this country to produce those new energies, we will continue to be in Iraq, and the next generation will be in Kazakhstan, and the one after that will be in Venezuela. The greatest challenge in the history of this country is before us today. That's the next president of the United States, the one that gets that figured out and says it straight. Because I got to tell you, people all over this country know that to be true. Those are the facts, and we need somebody to tell it to us straight. Now, how many of you know who Tom Brokaw is? You know who Tom Brokaw is? Well, Tom Brokaw started out in South Dakota. You know, he's a farm kid from South Dakota, and then he married Miss South Dakota. Meredith was Miss South Dakota, and then he became kind of a newscaster guy, and he did the evening news on the West Coast and East Coast, and of course now he big shot with NBC. Well, Tom Brokaw, like a lot of other rich people, they've bought a ranch in Montana. But what's happening at the Brokaw Ranch is Meredith is attempting to spend all of the money that they've made in the last 40 years on horses during the next 4, and she's just about there. But Tom Brokaw, he wrote a best-selling book. Do you remember what the name of that best-selling book was? What was the name of that? Greatest Generation. Now, the premise of this book was that generation that grew up in the Great Depression, that period of time where nearly everyone who graduated from high school, nearly every one of those high school graduates had no idea where they were going to get a job. In fact, many of them didn't know anybody in their family, their father, their mother, their uncle, their grandparents that even had a job in the private sector. And people all over America were saying out loud, does democratic capitalism even work? This was one of the greatest tests in the history of this country. And this generation who were tested through this era, the day after Pearl Harbor, were challenged one more time. And in a 4-year period, this generation, who started with the 5th most powerful military in the world, in a 4-year period, they trained the most significant military force in the world. They built all of our military arms, and they defeated the tyrants in both Asia and Europe. And Tom Brokaw calls them the greatest generation. I wasn't there, you weren't there. My dad was there, he's part of that generation. But then, later, and this is something I do know a little bit about. I remember out there in the Judith Basin, and I was only 5, 6 years old, and everyone was talking about something happening in the night skies. And of course, out in central Montana, you can see every star. For you big shots that are in the cities, you know, the Milky Way is something that is all across the sky. It's not just a few stars here and there, but everyone in America in 1960 was gazing into the night skies because we were looking for a very fast-moving light. What was the name of that fast-moving light we were looking for? Sputnik. Now, Sputnik was just a light that was racing across the night sky, but what it represented was America's failure in innovation and engineering in aerospace technology. It said that the Russians were a generation ahead of America in aerospace technology and probably a lot of other technologies. And it was John Kennedy, about a month before he was assassinated, who stood in Houston. And even though his advisors were divided, even though many of his scientific advisors said to him, Mr. President, don't say we're going to get to the moon in 10 years. We don't even know if you can go to the moon. And if you did get to the moon, we don't know if you could land. It might be 300 feet of just dust, and we are pretty sure we'd never be able to get those people back home. But John Kennedy understood something. He understood that if you want to harness the innovation of the American people, you need to challenge the American people. And so on that day, he challenged every 5th grade teacher to find that next science student, that next engineer, that next physicist who would change the world. He challenged every university and every corporation to work together until America led in innovation. He understood that in order for America to do great things, we have to ask America to sacrifice. And it was John Kennedy who said, we will go to the moon within 10 years. And I don't know about the rest of you. I remember what I was doing. I was actually, I was swathing hay, and I asked my parents if I could come back in and watch it on that black and white television when we announced that we had landed. And when we landed that spacecraft, we had less computing technology on board than you do with your cell phone. Now, it was John Kennedy who understood that if you want America to do great things, you've got to challenge America to do great things. And after 9/11, George Bush asked us and challenged us to go to the malls and spend money. What a lost opportunity. Imagine if we would have had a leader the day after 9/11 who would have said to us, let me say this straight to the American people. Within 15 years, we will be energy independent. We will produce energy from wind and solar. We will produce energy from sources that we have domestic. We shall never again be dependent on oil from dictators from around the world. If he would have said that on this day, George Bush would be considered one of the greatest presidents in the history of this country, and we would be halfway to achieving our goals. Instead, we've lost 6 important years. Now, we have an opportunity, folks. We not only have an opportunity to clean up the mistakes of the last 100 years, we have an opportunity, and we could be the greatest generation in the history of this country. We could be the generation that takes care of the 7th generation that follows us. We could be that generation that unlocks the keys to producing energy without destroying this planet. If you get it right, you'll be known as the greatest generation. Good luck. Now, I told you about that dang dog of mine. He got a book written about him. Okay. So then, about 2-3 weeks ago, we get a call from a magazine. And the magazine says, we'd like to send a reporter out, and we'd like that reporter just to kind of tag along with you for a couple of days because we would like to do a special on what's happening in Montana. Once again, I'm thinking, oh boy, they're noticed what we're doing in alternative energy, and they're kind of excited about Montana's economy and what we're doing in restoration economy and how we're changing the dynamics in the Rocky Mountain West. And so we inquired, what is the name of this magazine? And they said, well, the name of the magazine is Bark Magazine. We have 131,000 subscribers, and we'd like to write a story about JAG. So today I have the reporter from Bark Magazine who's been following JAG around for the last couple of days. You know, at the end of my first year in office, you know, these reporters or these big newspapers, they pay for polls. About every year, they do that in your own states. They pay for a poll, and they poll people on what they think about issues and what they think about some of the congressmen and senators and the governor in your state, and they pay for these polls, and they put them in their newspaper, and then people will buy the newspapers. Well, at the end of my first year in office, they polled our congressmen, and they polled our U.S. senators, and they polled me, and well, I was kind of happy, you know. I had a 69% job approval. I thought, well, that's not bad for, you know, first year. And so then they went through the senators and the congressmen, and then for the first time in the history of Montana, maybe the first time any time in America, they polled my dog. Now, why would they poll a dog? Well, it's because the Republicans complained for the whole first year that I was disrespectful of the office because I brought my dog to work and I wore jeans. And I'm thinking the whole time, I think they're missing the point here. I think most people in Montana like to wear jeans to work and bring their dog along with them. And so I just kept bringing my dog and wearing my jeans. Well, so they decided that they would poll my dog. And I was kind of interested in the results because what we found after 1 year in office, Jag and I, we found that his job approval, now what job does he have? I have any idea. But his job approval was 10 points higher than mine. His name recognition was greater than our one congressman in Montana. And so, you know, I'm new at politics. This is the first thing I've ever been elected to. And so I thought that I'm going to find a mentor to follow to try and improve my approval ratings. So I thought about the relationship that Jag and I have had over the last couple of years, and I know that I speak at a lot of these things, and I have a lot of people that come in and visit with me, and I have conversations going with people all day, and sometimes I speak at breakfast and lunch and afternoon, a lot of speeches, visiting with a lot of folks, and this dog never says a word. If he likes somebody, he'll kind of wag his tail and rub his nose against them. If they're a lobbyist or something, he'll just growl at them and walk away. And so I've been thinking, he with that big approval rating, me with much less, I'm going to change my behavior during the rest of the time that I'm elected. I can assure you the rest of the time I'm governor, I will be wagging my tongue a lot less and my tail a lot more. So again, thank you very much, and have a nice evening. Appreciate it.